Hi. For my AP Chemistry final project, I decided to do the chemistry of food or baking specifically as the topic I wanted to cover. Baking is a hobby that many people have. Personally, I don't do that much baking, but I thought it'd be a fun thing to try for the final project. And I know a lot of people right now are bored at home trying to find something to do. And I think finding the time for a hobby like baking now is like the perfect time to pick that up. Personally, I thought the project, at least the baking, was really fun and it wasn't all that difficult. And the bonus was at the end, I also got to eat something. So that's just an introduction. First, I want to go over kind of the recipe I used for my muffins. I basically made brown sugar muffins, and obviously you need brown sugar for that. So I had a cup of brown sugar, an egg, half a cup of butter, 2 cups of flour, a teaspoon of baking soda, a fourth of a teaspoon of salt, and a cup of milk. There were some optional things in the recipe. For example, if you really wanted to, you could put in some nuts into it, or you could try putting vanilla extract, but we didn't have any. So I just went ahead and used some basic things. Just for specifics, the butter is supposed to be unsalted, and actually we ran out of brown sugar before I could finish making the muffins. So I had to substitute some of it with regular sugar. But everything worked out fine, and the muffins tasted pretty good. So basically, the instructions for the muffins are super easy. The first step is you just have to melt the butter, and then using a microwave and on low power, and I'll explain why a little later. Afterwards, you want to mix your butter and all the sugar that you have together, and at the end, you'll mix everything else in. You'll put your egg in, your milk, and then all your other powders like your salt. And then at the end, you can put in your flour. This was pretty much my first time baking in a really long time, so I definitely made some mistakes along the way. And there were a few times where I thought my batter definitely was not looking right or I made a mistake. But in the end, everything worked out. One thing to note is after I mixed the butter and the sugar together, it looked horrible, and I really thought I messed something up, but in the end, it actually turned out okay. So in terms of the actual baking, just put your batter that you've made into individual tiny muffin papers, and then don't fill them up too full. And afterwards, you're going to want to bake for 15 to 20 minutes at around 375 degrees Fahrenheit. I think put a little too much batter in each of my muffins, and I made them a little too big, so I baked them for a little longer. But if you want to check, you can always use a toothpick and stick it in the middle. And if no batter is attached to your toothpick when you bring it out, that means it should be cooked. Also, the sugar should be incorporated. There are actually big like cracks and like clumps of sugar in my muffins because I didn't mix the sugar and the butter well enough in the first stage. But ultimately, the muffins are still good, so it doesn't matter. In terms of the chemistry behind muffins, there's a few topics I'm going to want to talk about today. And one of the things I want to talk about is why muffins are so tender and where the bubbles inside of the muffins come from. So basically, in the recipe I had, you're supposed to add baking soda, but a lot of other recipes also use baking powder or one of these two products. And the reason why these two products are so important is because they can react with acids to produce H2CO3, which then breaks down into H2O and CO2 gas bubbles that end up being the bubbles that appear in your muffins and cause them to rise. In terms of baking soda, it's actually just sodium bicarbonate, so it needs to react with acid to be able to turn into sodium ions and H2CO3. Because baking soda is only sodium bicarbonate, you're going to need to add some other acid for it to work. For baking powder, they'll add other things in the powder with sodium bicarbonate. There'll be different types of like acids, and basically what happens is when it's in the powderized form, nothing will happen. But when you mix it up together and heat it up, it'll start the reaction and really get it going to produce the CO2 bubbles and create the reaction to create the bubbles in your muffins. In terms of the muffins that I made, the recipe called for using baking soda. And I think the reason that is because usually you need some sort of acid to make sure the baking soda can produce your CO2 and produce the gas bubbles. And because I used milk in my recipe, the milk likely provided some of that acid, so the sodium bicarbonate and the baking soda could react and then produce the bubbles to cause my muffins to rise. Another thing that some people know about, if you're better at baking than me, is if you make muffins, you really don't want to overmix your batter. And this is for one really big reason. Basically, how flour and water work when you mix them together is that proteins in flour will contact water. When they contact water, they'll form gluten and create this super stretchy network of molecules. And this stretchy network of molecules is what creates this super chewiness. And the two proteins that cause this are called glutenin and gliadin. And basically, if you mix a batter for too long, you're going to cause the glutens to form more and more. And these are just going to get mixed up and then become really chewy. And that's a mistake I actually made because I thought there were too many lumps in my batter. But either you want to mix the first two products, the butter and the sugar, a lot better so there won't be clumps. And then afterwards, you also want to make it so when you're adding your flour, you don't stir for too long. Otherwise, your muffins will be a little bit too rubbery or it won't have the best texture, which is one of the problems I actually had. Another reason or thing that I learned during my baking process was that you really should heat butter under like a cap or a lid or some sort of container, because basically if you know more about baking and doing stuff than I do, then you'll realize that microwaving butter can sometimes cause pops or explosions that'll splatter your butter everywhere. Basically, as you melt the butter, it'll separate into a layer of fat and some water. And because the fat is lighter than the water, it'll rise up while the water goes down. As the microwave does its thing, it increases the speed of the molecules. Eventually, some of the water molecules will heat up enough to turn into steam, and then they'll rise up and then cause the oil that's melted now to splatter everywhere. And obviously, that's an annoyance to clean up. So if you're ever microwaving butter, one thing you should definitely know is to put your microwave on a lower power setting and just go for a longer time, or put some container on that you don't mind getting dirty that you can wash off later, unless for some reason you enjoy cleaning your microwave a lot. Another really interesting thing is why eggs are usually added to baking products. Eggs have a lot of proteins and they start in a really packed folded structure. However, when you put them in your batter and spin them around, whisk them around, and after you put it into the oven, basically the proteins will unfold and get longer. And then as you heat them, they'll make chains with each other and link with each other, creating a better structure for your muffins and cause them to have a more rigid and defined structure. Anyways, these are some of the sources I use for my project and I use for my research. Obviously, I did some of my research afterwards because I realized a lot of the problems I had during baking, and I wanted to figure out why I had these problems and how to fix these in the future, and then I could create this as a more educational experience, not only for myself, but hopefully so you learned a little bit. And then here's a few more pictures of my muffins. The muffins, although the texture wasn't the best, I thought they actually tasted pretty good. You can see some of the brown sugar clumps on the top and everywhere else, but overall the taste was really good and I liked it a lot. Probably the only thing I would change is the mixing the batter less, and also next time I would probably add a little bit more sugar because I think I did a little less in the recipe just to make sure it wasn't too sweet. and I would probably add a little less batter into each muffin paper because I want more muffins than non-muffins next time. I think I poured too much batter. The recipe called for an estimation of like maybe 12 muffins, but I messed up some steps, so I had to get rid of a little of my batter. But overall, I think the muffins were pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and I definitely did from this project. I think that baking is something that's super fun, and I'm definitely excited to continue trying it in the future.